Hello, I'm pleased to present Mr. Mannequins Tools, an add-on for Blender 2.8 that enables you to export animations and weighted meshes that are directly compatible with the UE4 Mannequin in Unreal Engine without having to retarget anything. It saves me a whole lot of hassle, like with the whole retargeting thing, and I find it really useful, so I certainly hope you do as well. I've tried to record this video about 5 or 6 times, and every time I start recording it, I end up with an hour-and-a-half monologue of everything that's going on in this armature, because I've spent a lot of time working with this rig and working on it, and this time I'm just going to keep it short and concise because that's what I want for the video, and you can explore the add-on and everything in it yourself and figure out what's going on. I will mention a few specific things where they're really needed, but otherwise, yeah, I'm just going to leave you to explore this. So I'm just quickly whipping up an animation so I can actually give an example of the export process working. I'm making this animation keeping in mind that I wanted to show that root motion and various other bones and mechanisms are all going to go through perfectly. So now that's finished, I'm just going to come in here. I think I'm going to change the animation's name quickly, because then I can show the naming conventions that are going on here. So let's just call this test action. So nice and clear. And then I think I'm going to give Mr. Mannequin's head a shape key as well. Let's give him a bobble head so that I can show that shape keys are going through fine. Yeah, that should be suitably amusing. Means we can certainly tell the meshes apart when we're in the engine shortly. So exporting this. Now this whole add-on revolves around the rig being selected, and that brings up most of the options, particularly for the export. So I'm just going to close this stash for the moment. I'll come back and say a few things about that in a little while. So I'm going to want to be exporting meshes, and I'm going to want to be exporting animations. I can put these both into 2 different folders, but I'm not going to. And there's a few things that this export script is dependent on. One of them is that the blend file has been saved, so we have to be saved. You can't do it, just open a blend file and straight up do it. It will say, no, you need to have saved your blend before we can do this. Or at least it will say that in the console anyway. And I need to set the frame rate to 30 because that's what Unreal Engine is going to be using. And currently everything's dependent on a unit scale of 1. So you must be using a unit scale of 1 for this export script to function correctly. I am going to add in some script that will pick up what your unit scale is and then scale to Unreal Engine scale accordingly. So that's going to happen probably in the next month or 2, but for now this depends on the unit scale being 1. So we can either export meshes or batch export meshes. If we are not batch exporting them, they all get stuffed into one FBX file together. And with animations, if we aren't batch exporting animations, then you get only the active animation on that the rig you have selected is using. Only that one animation gets exported, and I'll be able to show the naming once I've exported everything. So a mesh will only be exported if it has an armature modifier targeting the active rig. So to export the mesh, you select the mesh you want to export, and then you select the rig that it's attached to, and that should then go through fine and dandy. There are apply modifiers and start end keyframes options. Ticking apply modifiers will stop shape keys from being exported, so I'm not going to be using that here, but you may have a use for that. And forcing start end keyframes. Now sometimes the end frame of the animation doesn't go through perfectly. So if you find that the numbers aren't adding up between Blender and Unreal Engine, re-exporting the animation with start end keyframes set to true will often fix that. It's fixed a few other problems for me as well, such as occasionally I'll get an error from Unreal Engine saying there's no animation track in the exported FBX, but that's only on really short animations, I've noticed. So that's there. Sometimes you may need to use it, sometimes you might not. I'm going to tick it for now just to be on the safe side. And this should now export correctly. This use visual location option here is something that I've scripted, and it's not finished. It's just there for me to test, and I've had a lot of negative results using visual keying with this. So I'd suggest leaving it alone and not actually using it unless you're keying everything visually. So that's the talking I need to do about the export, really. So I'm going to click Export FBX here. Now, depending on how many keyframes your animations have, this Export FBX button may take a fair little while to process everything. I did do some stress testing with it, and the worst it ever was when I keyframed every single bone, every frame for nice long animations. Blender sat there not responding for about 5 minutes, and then it came back to life and all the FBXs had exported correctly. So hitting Export FBX has not crashed me at all. So you should never crash. So if your processing power isn't quite what mine is, then you might need to wait a bit longer for long animations to export correctly. So that should then now have exported the mesh and the animations. And I'm going to quickly just export a batch exported mesh because that changes the naming convention as well. So I'll do that like so. Just quickly export that as well. Now let's open up a fresh third person template project. So once that's loaded, I'm just going to right click here and import to game, and I'm going to navigate to where I dumped these 3 FBX files, which was here, because that's where I have that blend file saved at the moment. So I'm going to go over the naming. So if you're batch exporting a mesh, it's going to come up with the object's name for the FBX. If you're not batch exporting a mesh and they're all stuck together into one FBX file, then it's going to come up with the armature's name and an integer suffix of how many objects were exported with it. And the animation name is always the name of the armature followed by the name of the action. So that's that bit gone over. I'll quickly just import the animation first. All I'm going to do with this is set the default skeleton that's just been created with the project and click import. Do nothing else. Check no other options, just the default settings, so I can see if this has worked correctly. So here we have the animation that I made. It looks like it's going through fine. Let me just whack it to the end to see if I need to, so I can show that the root bone is at 100, 100, 100, which is exactly as it is in Blender. So yeah, this is all going through correctly, I believe. Yeah, that looks about right to me. It's the animation I made. So let's hoik that into there, and then I'll import one of the meshes. These are both identical mesh FBXs, it's just the naming I wanted to show. So I'll take the SK Mannequin LOD 0. Now here, the only difference between the importing the animation is I'm going to make sure that import morph targets is checked in this little drop down here. So just making sure that import morph targets is checked. Otherwise I set it to the same skeleton, the same default skeleton as before, and just click import. Oh, I forgot to get rid of the materials, so we don't need these materials. I tend to do most of my material work for anything in Unreal Engine actually in Unreal Engine, so I'll just copy the nodes that I've used in Blender across and recreate the material in Unreal Engine as best as I can. More about that shortly. So just get rid of those two, we don't need them. Now we have this mesh here. Let's give it the default materials it's supposed to have, which would be UE4 man body and chest logo. There we go. So it's got those now. You can see all the materials go on fine there. We've got our shape key here. It's now going to force us to reload the materials because, as you can see up here in yellow, the following materials need saving to fully support morph targets. That's just how it works. But we've got this morph target, goes in fine and works okay. It can go to -1, but that's because, and it couldn't in Blender because I didn't set the range for it in Blender. So in Blender it's 0 to 1, here it's -1 to 1, but that's fine. This isn't really a video about morph targets. So let's just whack that up to full, and then I can show, so we've seen our animation on the default skeleton, now we can see a default animation on our mesh that's come from Blender with its shape key. So what should we do? Let's do the third person run, that's nice and familiar, and there we go. This is all, looks to me like it's all going through exactly as it's supposed to. So that's the import export. You can see everything works, everything's fine, and all quite happily goes onto the default skeleton here. So now I don't really need to have any of this open anymore, so I can jump back to Blender and talk about the rest of the things that I need to talk about. So what's next to talk about? Let's have a little talk about the rigs. There's a few things I need to go over here. For the most part, I'd like to just let you explore it, but there's a few things I do need to mention. So if I can get my camera pointed correctly, get a good view of him. If we go to the armature tab, so there's these two protected layers here. The bones on these two layers must never be edited in edit mode and should never be keyframed. So don't touch them in edit mode and don't touch them in pose mode. Just leave these guys well alone. You can change the bone layer, so you can move them wherever you want bone layer wise, but they can't be edited in edit mode at all. They have to remain exactly as they are. These are the deform bones. These are what's actually getting exported to the FBX. And these are mechanism bones, which are exact duplicates of the deform bones, but are parented to their equivalent control bones, which are all these yellow bones throughout these other layers. So to cut a long story short, this is how I make animation compatible with the default mannequin. So changing these two layers here will completely mess that up, and changing the control bones locations. So changing the location of the head of any control bone in edit mode. So that is just the head. The location of the heads of any control bones must remain identical to the deform and mechanism bones head location. Now I don't really, you can go through and see how this works if you want. Basically the deform bones have copy transforms constraints to the mechanism bones, then each mechanism bone is parented to its control bone, and that means that we can then indirectly animate deform bones using these control bones, which we can point in any direction, meaning we can make IK compatible with them. I wouldn't suggest messing around with anything really too much on this rig unless you actually know your rigging, because you could end up messing up the IK chains or other constraints that are working. So let's turn off these two layers here. There's not too much more I want to go over with this. I just want to mention about the pivot bones quickly, because you may not have seen this before. So I haven't put in an IK to FK switch for this yet. I do have a method for doing that. I just haven't got around to writing the script for it yet. But I prefer using this method instead of using an FK switch, where we rotate the IK targets to wherever we want them, and then we select both IK targets. Then we select a pivot bone, and we rotate around the active element using the pivot bone as the active element, meaning we get an FK-like movement while the IK is still switched on. And this kind of a movement will stay within IK stiffness as well. So it means I just find it a lot less hassle than switching FK on and off, IK and FK on and off. It's just easier to keep the IK on and keep everything within the IK stiffness. I'll show that with the arm here quickly. I can grab the hand target, select the pivot bone for the arm here. You can see it's staying within its IK stiffness and limits, which I find makes for much more fluid animation than switching to FK to tweak rotations in. So yeah, that's just a little trick for you. And I wanted to talk about something else that I haven't actually seen documented anywhere, so I might be the only person that's doing this. But I find this bone here is technically a pivot bone, but it's not used for rotating around. It's used to control the constraints on the upper arm twists. So let's get that layer up. So An upper arm twist generally has a damp track to a point in the elbow so that it holds the shoulder back. And I've found that by parenting this bone to this upper arm twist pivot bone, I can then also limit its rotation towards the body. So if I have an animation where the character is reaching across himself to grab, say, a sword from his hip perhaps, just to put this into position quickly, you'll notice that there's quite a lot of clipping with the body there as it is, but having this pivot bone here means we can greatly reduce the movement of the shoulder in situations like this. So if I turn off the constraint that's limiting the rotation, you'll see just how much counter animation would be needed to fix this. So having this on and parenting the twist bone to its own little control here means I don't have to mess around with turning the damp track on and off if I want to counter animate this bone. And yeah, I find it really useful, and I hope you find that useful as well. It's the same for the leg as well. If we were to rotate the leg into an uncomfortable position quickly, let's just put it right up here or something. So we put our leg into a nice uncomfortable position there. The twist bone's being held back to stop it from clipping the body. This is especially useful on a weighted character mesh that wouldn't be solid body parts like Mr. Mannequin, because this, particularly on the thigh here, it just simulates the bunching of the muscles and the stretching of the skin really well. So if I turn this off, you can see the huge difference there of how much clipping there is with the body, which there isn't because this bone is held back by its limit rotation. So anything else to go over quickly with this? There's child-of constraints on all of the IK targets. If you want to use the IK roots down here, this can be useful for mirroring animation. So if your character isn't facing forward, you can effectively mirror the animation across. So generally I like to have independent IK, where they're completely independent from everything and I don't have to worry about keyframing it. But having these child-of constraints here can be useful for some animations. I'm going to create a method of switching them on and off during keyframing, but for now you kind of need to choose an option here. You'll need to either be using child-of constraints for your IK targets or not using them. And then there's also copy locations and copy rotations on these IK roots themselves for the feet and the hands that will cause them to directly follow the root bone. And that's another piece of functionality that some animators like to have. So that's there if you want to use it. But again, you kind of need to choose your option here and not try and keyframe it, because I'm going to create a system where you can turn all of these options on and off. And I might end up being able to remove some of the constraints that are doing this and drive everything instead. For the fingers, there's currently an easy little copy rotation system here, which is offset. And I do have, there's quite a lot of different ways of animating fingers, so feel free to change this up however you want. But these are offset copy rotations on the Z-axis. I don't really like this method. I have a couple of other methods that I might be putting in, and I might try and make them optional as well. Anything else to talk about quickly about this? There's this copy rotation on Spino 2, because I tend not to use the Spino 2 bone. I tend not to actually animate it, because most of the time it tends to follow Spino 1's rotation. So whatever rotation Spino 1 is doing, the Spino 2 bone is most likely going to be taking some of that rotation with it, because that's just how a humanoid spine works. So I don't normally end up keyframing or doing anything with this bone until the sort of final stage of animation, when I'm just making everything perfect. So if you don't like using this and you want to keyframe it, by all means you can turn this off. This is something you could keyframe on and off, though the copy rotation is offset, so you can still rotate it even though it's copying rotation. There is a driver that you probably shouldn't mess with in the foot rolling mechanism here. This is a pretty standard way of controlling feet for animation, so that you can push the IK into position when the foot rolls forwards. This is a pretty standard piece of animation tech, but I've added a driver to it inside the sort of gizmo bones for it. Here, there's a driver there that stops the heel from falling through the IK target here, because otherwise, to get all of these points of rotation need to be, and the bone rolls of these bones here need to be directly in line with the feet and the toe bones. They have to be these are very precise bones here. So I've set that all up very precisely for you, and there's even a driver here to stop the foot from dropping through where it's supposed to be, so you get a very nice clean foot rolling motion. You can also twist this heel target from left to right, but there's a bit of a problem with it still that I plan on fixing, maybe with another driver, where if you have it rotated up and you do twist it, then the foot's going to go off at a slant, and if you don't want that, you have to counter animate the IK target in order to fix it. I want to get rid of the need to do this, so that the toe will always try and stay flat on the floor within maybe some limits or something. So that's something that I might fix at some point, but it's not really an essential piece of rigging. It's just something that might change, so it could affect your keyframes in the future. And we have this floor target here for the foot, which is rotationally based. So if we have it in its rest pose here, and we move it, it's going to stop the foot going through the floor. If we rotate it round onto its side, let's do it by -90 there, then it also stops the foot going through a wall, if that's what you want. So if you want to be running along ceilings and walls and stuff in animations, then this bone comes in quite handy. And I think that is just about everything I really need to talk about this rig. I want to add head tracking as well, but there's quite a few different ways. A bit like with fingers, there's a lot of different ways of animating head tracking, so I haven't really finished experimenting with what I feel is best for this. And I'm going to be adding in a more advanced rig as well for dismemberment, where all of the IK chains and all of the parts of the IK chain can be disconnected from the armature itself during animation, so that you can create crazy animations where his arm falls off and then runs away from him and he's got to go and catch it. And you can do that all within the same armature without having to swap things in and out, which can come in quite handy. But that's a more advanced rig. It's got more advanced settings for some other stuff as well, and it's nearly finished, but not quite. So that'll probably come in the next update. So there'll be 2 armatures for you to choose from. Right, that's the armature talk done. I'm not talking about this anymore. This is already getting too long. So now I just need to talk quickly about the stashing system I've got going on here. So to begin with, this was just a method of me giving you the choice of which mesh and which materials you might want to load from the add-on, along with the rig. At the moment there's only one rig to choose from, but that's going to change. And then I developed it into something a bit more than that, so that you can actually create your own custom folder and then save your own meshes and materials to be pulled out in a Blender at a later date and loaded with whatever rig you've chosen to load. So I don't really want to go into too much detail about this. All the tooltips should tell you what does what. I will mention that when you load a mesh, if the material it's using is already currently in the blend file that you're working with, it will use the material that's already in the blend file instead of loading a new one. So you'll need to, if you want to change materials for different meshes, you're going to need to duplicate those. You're going to need to duplicate the material to change the settings. And what else is there that I needed to mention about this? When loading, so these are all the default meshes, the default materials, and the default armatures. No matter what folder you're using, I'll show setting that up in a moment, these guys always will appear. They'll always be there in these drop down menus, whichever one of your custom folders you're working from. These can't be deleted unless you actually go into the add-ons folder and delete them from there yourself. They can't be deleted and they always appear. So these are have their own separate stash that's always being processed, because I might need to update these things and it's better that they're in the add-ons folder. So let's add a stash folder. So I'm just going to call this UE4. So this is the name of the folder. So this is how you want to name your stash, and this is the location where it's going to be on your computer. This needs to be your folder and drive that this is going to be put into needs to have write permissions. So if this doesn't work and it won't add, then you need to check the permissions of your folder and or drives. So I'm just going to stick this in here for now, and then if I add stash, we get another drop down that appears up here, and this is going to contain the stash folders. You can create more than one and have as many as you like. So you can add another stash, and we've got that there now. you'll only ever be operating from whichever stash is showing in this stash drop down menu here. So this is where you can save and load and remove things from. So that's where these buttons get directed to. So you can kind of organize everything yourself. You don't have to have your file pathing dictated by me. So yeah, that's quite free. There's a couple of issues with this though. So let me quickly just stash the default cube to show you how this works. So a bit like the exporting of meshes, stashing a mesh must have an armature modifier to the active rig. So I select the object I want to add and then select the rig. And from there, I can then stash meshes. There's overwrite meshes, overwrite materials, packing images. I recommend you do this. Parenting to active is up to you. That's for when it loads. And auto-saving materials means that all the materials on the mesh that you're stashing will automatically be saved into the stash as well. And all of those materials that get auto-saved will be using whatever settings are set up here in the stash materials pane. So if I stash this cube, it will then appear here and I can load it. Its materials in there because I'm auto-saving the material. So the material is in there for me to use and it's currently in the UE4 stash. So if I switch to using the test stash, it's going to disappear from the drop-down menu and only the defaults are going to remain there for me to load from. So you can only be customly loading, saving and removing things using whichever folder you have selected here. So I'm going to switch it back to UE4 and talk about the one other problem that we have. So if I just open this up quickly, you can see the UE4 stash and we have our material and our cube in there. Now, for some reason it's fine for me to remove the cube and remove the material. So if we go back there, they will have been deleted. Yeah, so they're no longer in this folder. However, when it's time to, if we want to delete a stash, so if I click delete stash, what happens is it removes it from the add-ons memory, but it doesn't actually remove the folder physically from the computer. I haven't quite figured this out yet. I know that I have write permissions set for this folder, for this drive and everything, and I'm getting a write permissions error. The one thing I haven't tested is running Blender as administrator to do this, but I didn't really want to make an add-on that required you to use administrator. So when you delete a stash folder, you are going to have to delete the stash folder manually yourself from your computer. That's not too much there's not really too much I can do about that, but if I find a way of fixing it, I will. And don't worry about, so you could just skip pressing delete stash there altogether, and you could just open up the folder and delete it. If you delete it without removing it from the add-ons memory, it's going to automatically remove it from this drop-down menu here for you. So it automatically removes it from the add-on memory if you physically delete the stash folder from your computer. So you don't get this folder isn't here anymore errors. You don't get any errors like that in the console, hopefully. The only other issue I've had, which is very sporadic, doesn't often happen, is sometimes when I'm loading a custom mesh from a custom folder, it will crash Blender, and then when I open Blender again, the mesh has appeared in the blend file and no data has been lost, everything's done what it's supposed to, it's just crashed Blender during that process. I'm not entirely sure why that is, and it hadn't done this to me at all, and then yesterday when I was testing with this, it happened to me, and I was like, oh no, I'm just about to upload this add-on, and then when I tried to recreate the error, I couldn't recreate it, so I'm not sure what went on there, and so I'm going to need to do some research into that. So if you do load a custom mesh, I'm just going to stash that mesh. So if I was to load the cube right now, it might crash on me, and I'm not entirely sure why that is. Sometimes it does it, sometimes it doesn't. It's good for me to mention that. So this whole stashing system is totally a work in progress. I'm going to add the ability for you to stash your own rigs as well. So you could take my rig here and edit it, change the bones around, change the custom bone shapes, all this stuff. You could do all your own rigging and then stash that rig in your custom stash and load it whenever you want, just like you'd load one of my rigs. So I'm going to add the functionality of that too, but rigs do need to be treated slightly differently to meshes and materials for this add-on to work correctly, so I've got a little bit more work to do on that before I can implement it. So yeah, this whole stashing system was just means to save your custom characters into a place that you can easily load them. That's what it's designed for. It's designed so that you can save your orc and your human both into your custom stash folder, and then build an environment for them, then load them and make them have a fight, make them do everything they need to do, you know. So you can just really easily, without having to go between blends, copying, pasting characters to different places, you can just load those straight from within here if it works correctly for you. So that's everything I need to talk about with stashing. I'd like to say thank you to SpectralVectors for his mannequin material video, because had he not have made that video, I wouldn't have felt inspired to create this material right here. So I was using his material for a while and I think it looks great, but I wanted something even more accurate, so I opened up the Mannequins material myself in Unreal Engine and I copied it across into Blender node for node as best as I could. And there's a few things that are a bit different, like the mixed normals material function in Unreal Engine isn't really Blender compatible, so I have a slightly different way of doing that in here. And for some reason, to get the rubber to look just right, I've had to crank its transmission setting. So that's why I wanted to talk about this material. So if you're going to be rendering this mannequin mesh in Blender, then you're going to need to tweak this transmission depending on the lighting that he's under. It can be quite low if he's under a sun, but if he's under a spotlight or a light that's really close to him, if the light's really bright, it needs to have quite high transmission to look like it does in Unreal. So this is what it's supposed to look like in Blender, but I find that most of the time around 0.7 is what it's actually looking like in Unreal Engine. So there's that to consider. I may put this in as an option in a menu somewhere. And that's about all I need to talk about with this material. Okay, so that's about it for this video. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe, and hit the bell icon as well, because when I make updates for this, I'm going to be creating videos that cover everything that changes or gets fixed or updated, and there should always be at least one link in the description below to somewhere that you can download this add-on. And I plan on adding loads of content to it, loads of additional functionality, entirely new rigs, a female mannequin, and a pose mode menu for easier keyframing of constraints and stuff. Yeah, there's a lot coming for this. It's completely free and it's always going to be free.